August 12, 1942. Tulagi Harbor, Solomon Islands. At the motor torpedo boat base, a radio operator urgently transcribed a message from Henderson Field. A Japanese destroyer force had been detected moving southeast through the slot. Estimates placed the arrival of multiple vessels in Iron Bottom Sound by 0200 hours. Lieutenant Hugh Robinson, one of the first PT boat commanders in the Solomons, scrutinized the reconnaissance report. The odds were stark. 4 boats against an unknown number of Japanese destroyers, warships that had exercised absolute dominion over these waters since the war's inception. Yet none of the participants realized that these 77-foot plywood craft were poised to launch a campaign of nocturnal harassment. This strategy would eventually compel the Imperial Japanese Navy to fundamentally overhaul its supply operations throughout the Solomon Islands. The Japanese possessed total command of the night waters surrounding Guadalcanal. Since the American landings in August, their destroyers had transported supplies and reinforcements down the slot, the narrow central passage, with near impunity. American forces dubbed these runs the Tokyo Express, the vital lifeline sustaining the Japanese troops on the island. The Imperial Navy's mastery of night combat had been catastrophically proven at Savo Island in August, where they sank 4 Allied heavy cruisers in just 32 minutes. Their crews were experts in nocturnal tactics, and their Type 93 long lance torpedoes could strike from 20,000 yards. Furthermore, their superior optics allowed lookouts to spot enemies in near total darkness, often outperforming early American radar. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's strategy was brutally simple. Control the night to control the supply lines, and thereby maintain the garrison. While American aircraft from Henderson Field might rule the daylight skies, the darkness belonged to Japan. And without these nightly runs, the 30,000 troops on Guadalcanal would face starvation within weeks. The PT boat, however, represented American industrial ingenuity pushed to its practical limits. Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 2 had arrived at Tulagi in August of 1942. Each 77-foot Elco boat displaced only 45 tons, with a draft of 5 feet, that allowed them to operate in shallows where destroyers could not follow. Lieutenant Roland Westholm, commanding one of the early vessels, inspected his armament in the fading light. 2 twin 50-caliber machine gun turrets and 4 21-inch tubes carrying Mark 8 torpedoes. These weapons were notoriously unreliable, suffering a 50% failure rate due to defective magnetic detonators and depth running issues, and without radar, the boats relied entirely on sight and sound. The primary weapon of the PT boat was sheer speed, generated by 3 Packard 4M2500 12-cylinder engines, each producing 1,350 horsepower. They could hit 41 knots in calm seas, or a realistic 35 in combat, which was crucial for survival in the confined waters of Guadalcanal, where Japanese destroyers also topped out at 35 knots. The hull construction defied traditional shipbuilding, using 2 layers of mahogany planking to form a flexible shell capable of absorbing impacts that would crack steel. These boats were also a triumph of mass production. A unit could be built in 2 months for $263,000, whereas a destroyer required 18 months and $8 million. Motor machinists made first-class Eldon Center, a Detroit mechanic who had worked on the Packard production line, had spent 8 months mastering every acoustic nuance of these engines. He could diagnose mechanical problems by sound alone in complete darkness, a vital skill for keeping the temperamental machinery running. "These engines are temperamental," Center would explain to new crew members, warning that a wrong fuel mixture meant losing 200 horsepower, or that overheating would throw a rod. but he assured them that if treated correctly, the engines would deliver the necessary speed when it mattered most. Senta adjusted carburetor settings for the humidity of the Solomons and developed a pre-combat checklist to warm engines and adjust ignition timing for maximum acceleration. His innovations kept the boats operational long after manufacturer specifications indicated they should have failed. Commander Koshi Kaneda stood on the bridge of a Fubuki-class destroyer, leading a column of 3 ships down the slot at 28 knots. 20 years in the Imperial Navy had taught him that in these waters, every shadow could hide an enemy, and every phosphorescent trail might mark a torpedo. The mission was to deliver 800 drums of supplies to the garrison at Cape Esperance by pushing them overboard near the beach for soldiers to retrieve. Though inefficient, with only 30% of supplies typically reaching the shore, it was safer than attempting to unload while exposed to dawn air attacks. The destroyer's main vulnerabilities were its size and lack of agility. At 388 feet, it needed 800 yards to turn, and its guns could not depress enough to hit targets closer than 300 yards. Against small, fast targets at close range, the destroyer's advantages evaporated. On October 13, 1942, at 23:30 hours, 4 PT boats from Squadron 2 idled in the shadows of Savo Island. Their engines ran at minimum revolutions to muffle noise and reduce wake, while the crews maintained radio silence, using only hand signals and shielded blinker lights. Lieutenant Lester Gamble, in PT-48, led the patrol line, with boats spaced at 500-yard intervals to maximize detection. Lacking radar, they relied on the Mark I eyeball, human vision that had adapted to the darkness after hours without artificial light. At 23:47, a lookout spotted shadows on the horizon. 3 destroyers in column formation traveling at 25 knots toward Cape Esperance. Following standard doctrine, the PT boats prepared to approach from different angles to split the enemy's defensive fire. Facing the distinct disadvantage of commanding only 4 boats armed with notoriously unreliable torpedoes, Gamble determined that concentrating his forces was the only viable strategy. The plan dictated that all vessels would launch their attack from the destroyer's starboard quarter, firing at a range of 500 yards before scattering at maximum velocity. Leading the approach in PT-48, Gamble kept the engines throttled back to 1500 RPM until they closed within 1,000 yards, at which point he shoved the throttles forward, causing the boat to surge to 35 knots as it bore down on the last destroyer in the column. At the 500-yard mark, Gamble released 2 torpedoes, carefully calculating a 30-degree lead angle to intercept the target. However, the Mark 8 torpedoes betrayed their position with telltale wakes of bubbles, instantly alerting the Japanese lookouts who screamed the warning, "Good eye! Good eye!" signaling incoming torpedoes. The enemy helmsman desperately threw the wheel hard to port, allowing both projectiles to streak past the stern, missing by less than 20 yards. As star shells burst overhead, bathing the scene in harsh white light, 5-inch guns erupted, churning the water around PT-48 while Gamble executed violent zigzag maneuvers at full throttle to escape. PT-46 followed up the assault, closing to 400 yards before firing, but mechanical failures doomed the effort. One torpedo ran erratically while the other struck the destroyer's hull without detonating, a defect that would plague these crews throughout the war. Although the Americans claimed possible hits, Japanese records confirmed that all destroyers survived the encounter safely. Nevertheless, the aggression forced the enemy to dump their cargo prematurely, resulting in minimal supplies reaching the shore. This engagement provided the first concrete proof that these small boats could effectively disrupt logistics operations even without sinking enemy ships. The successful disruption on October 13th persuaded Admiral William Halsey to significantly reinforce these operations, and by November 1942, 12 PT boats were operating out of Tulagi. Armed with fresh tactics, born of hard experience, the crews prepared to interdict the Tokyo Express, which intelligence indicated ran on a predictable schedule every 3 to 5 nights, weather permitting. These convoys, typically consisting of 4 to 8 destroyers, followed a set route down the Slot and around Savo Island to reach various landing beaches along the northern coast of Guadalcanal. Drawing lessons from earlier skirmishes, Lieutenant Commander Thomas G. Warfield formulated a new tactical doctrine where boats would operate in coordinated sections of 3. Under this plan, one vessel would execute the torpedo run, while the others utilized their gunfire to create diversions, a necessary adaptation, given that torpedoes missed their mark at least 50% of the time. Even when the primary weapons failed, the suppressing fire compelled the destroyers to take evasive action, thereby interrupting their ability to offload supplies accurately. In the wake of surface engagements, where American cruisers had suffered defeats at the hands of Japanese destroyers, the PT boats evolved into a critical component of the broader interdiction campaign. While they could never hope to match the heavy firepower of a destroyer, their persistent harassment tactics while patrolling the approaches to Cape Esperance fundamentally altered Japanese operational behavior. Although the majority of torpedo attacks failed to score hits, the constant threat forced enemy commanders to maintain high speeds and zigzag continuously, often leading to hasty cargo dumps that dropped delivery efficiency to below 20%. When 11 Japanese destroyers approached Guadalcanal in the largest supply run to date, the PT fleet sortied to intercept, launching over 30 torpedoes without achieving a single confirmed hit, a stark illustration of their weapons' reliability issues. Despite the lack of physical damage, the psychological impact was profound, with Japanese after-action reports noting that enemy motor torpedo boats made operations extremely hazardous and necessitated constant, exhausting evasive maneuvers. Amidst these frustrations, PT-59 secured one of the few confirmed victories of the period by sinking the Japanese submarine I-3 as it attempted to deliver supplies. This success served as a crucial demonstration that, while fast destroyers remained difficult targets, the PT boats could be lethally effective against slower, less maneuverable vessels. The stakes escalated when Admiral Raizo Tanaka, Japan's most skilled destroyer commander, personally led the next supply mission aboard his flagship, the Teruzuki. This new Akizuki-class destroyer was a formidable adversary, equipped with advanced fire control systems and rapid-fire guns, and was accompanied by 10 additional destroyers, 6 of which were laden with supply drums. At 23:15, boats from Squadron 2 detected this massive formation off Cape Esperance, setting the stage for a major confrontation. Anticipating the threat, Tanaka positioned the Teruzuki as a rear guard to protect the supply-carrying destroyers as they moved inshore. But the Americans were ready with their refined collaborative tactics. PT-37 under Lieutenant Lester Gamble, along with PT-40 under Lieutenant John Searles, and PT-48 coordinated their approach to divide enemy attention and generate confusion. Their objective was to exploit the chaos of battle, a method they had honed over 2 months of relentless combat. At 23:23, one or more of the boats, historical accounts differ on whether it was PT-37, PT-40, or PT-48, launched torpedoes at the flagship from a range of approximately 500 yards. At least one Mark 8 torpedo slammed into the Teruzuki's port quarter, detonating against the steering compartment and inflicting catastrophic damage to the rudder and propeller shaft. The explosion reduced the ship's speed to 12 knots and ruptured fuel tanks, igniting a blaze that illuminated the vessel for miles and left Admiral Tanaka injured and temporarily relieved of command. As the destroyer Naganami came alongside to evacuate the admiral and the wounded, The rescue operation consumed 30 critical minutes, during which the entire Japanese formation milled about in confusion, jettisoning their supply drums far too early. Finally, at 0440 on December 12th, the intense heat from the fires cooked off the Teruzuki's depth charges, breaking the ship's back and sending her to the bottom in 800 feet of water. She became the largest Japanese warship definitively sunk by PT boats during the entire Second World War. The destruction of the Teruzuki marked the zenith of anti-destroyer operations in the Pacific. Although PT boats would not claim another Japanese destroyer, their cumulative pressure as part of the blockade was undeniable. Japanese records from the time reveal the extent of this disruption, admitting that the combination of motor torpedo boats, air attacks, and surface forces had rendered night supply operations increasingly untenable, driving delivery efficiency below sustainable levels. Even after recovering from his injuries, Admiral Tanaka acknowledged that while the enemy's small boats rarely achieved direct hits, their presence forced evasive maneuvers that severely degraded supply capabilities. Consequently, by January 1943, the Tokyo Express was forced to abandon destroyer runs in favor of submarine and barge operations, methods that proved even less efficient than the dangerous gauntlet they replaced. The relentless pressure of PT boat harassment, combined with airstrikes and surface actions, ultimately rendered Japanese destroyer operations unsustainable, signaling a paradigm shift in naval warfare, where integrated weapon systems could neutralize traditional advantages. While these mosquito boats rarely sank major warships on their own, their inclusion in a combined arms approach contributed significantly to the strategic victory, a success underpinned by overwhelming industrial capacity. The United States constructed 531 PT boats during World War II, with each vessel, requiring only 2 months to build, had merely 1/30th the cost of a standard destroyer. Even accounting for the high attrition rate, with 69 boats lost to various causes, they proved to be a remarkably cost-effective method of exerting control over the seas. To man these vessels, the Navy established a massive pipeline at the Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron's training center in Melville, Rhode Island, which produced over 1,000 officers and 10,000 enlisted men. These crews were pushed through an intensive 8-week program before deployment, and by mid-1943, their capabilities were enhanced by the arrival of SO radar sets that allowed for target detection at a range of 15 miles. Furthermore, the introduction of the improved Mark 13 torpedo in late 1943 significantly resolved earlier reliability issues, transforming these boats into lethal combatants, even as their primary mission remained the harassment and interdiction of smaller enemy craft. In response, the Imperial Navy attempted various countermeasures, such as sending destroyer escorts ahead of supply formations, or using float planes to drop flares. But these tactics often divided their forces, or inadvertently revealed their own positions. Consequently, the Japanese were forced to shift towards submarine supply operations, a desperate move that proved mathematically impossible to sustain. A submarine could carry only 20 tons of supplies, compared to the 200 tons a destroyer could transport, falling woefully short of the 400 tons required daily for the garrison. Recognizing this inevitability, the enemy adapted by developing armored barges for coastal runs, and from 1943 onward, these slower vessels became the primary and most successful targets for PT boat crews, disrupting maritime logistics. Service on these boats attracted a specific breed of volunteer, typically averaging 22 years of age, many of whom had never been to sea, before learning navigation and combat through harsh experience. The living conditions they endured were exceptionally primitive, lacking bunks, galleys, or proper heads. Crews subsisted on cold rations, used buckets for sanitation, and slept on deck whenever possible. The physical toll was immense, with tropical diseases infecting 80% of the sailors, while the psychological strain of being completely exposed during combat led to a 33% casualty rate. higher than any other branch of the naval service. Despite these hardships, morale remained incredibly high because these sailors viewed themselves as an elite force, fostering a unit cohesion that transcended traditional rank structures. The hazards and heroism inherent in this service are perhaps best exemplified by Lieutenant John F. Kennedy's command of PT-109, which collided with the destroyer Amagiri during a chaotic night action on August 2, 1943. Although the incident underscored the extreme danger these small wooden boats faced against steel hulls, the collision was a result of darkness rather than intentional ramming, leaving 11 of the 13 crew members alive in the water. Kennedy's subsequent leadership, including the legendary feat of towing an injured sailor for hours to reach safety, became a defining symbol of the resilience displayed by PT boat crews throughout the campaign. From a broader perspective, the PT boat campaign revolutionized the understanding of littoral warfare and asymmetric operations, proving that harassment value often exceeded direct combat statistics. While the boats definitively accounted for the sinking of only one destroyer, one submarine, and numerous barges, their true contribution lay in forcing the Japanese forces to adopt increasingly inefficient and desperate supply methods. This forced progression from destroyers to submarines, and finally to barges, represented a tactical victory achieved through the sheer attrition of the enemy's logistical capabilities. These concepts evolved into the doctrine behind modern fast attack craft, shifting emphasis from torpedoes to guided missiles, while retaining the core principles of speed, surprise, and the ability of small vessels to engage larger opponents. In the contested waters around Guadalcanal, these 77-foot plywood boats demonstrated that integrated naval operations could dismantle traditional superiority, not by defeating the Tokyo Express single-handedly, but by acting as a decisive component alongside air power and surface forces. The Japanese Navy, having entered the war confident in their night combat supremacy, was unprepared for an American strategy that employed multiple interdependent systems, which were individually vulnerable but collectively overwhelming. Commander Tamichihara, a Japanese officer who survived multiple encounters with these vessels, later noted that while the boats rarely hit them, they never let them rest, teaching the Imperial Navy that modern war required adaptation to unconventional threats. Ultimately, the final accounting of the campaign was strategically significant despite the limited tactical successes, resulting in the definitive sinking of the destroyer Teruzuki and the submarine I-3, alongside the disruption of hundreds of supply runs. The cumulative effect of thousands of tons of supplies being jettisoned or lost contributed directly to the Japanese defeat at Guadalcanal. Today, the wreck of the Teruzuki lies in 800 feet of water in Iron Bottom Sound, discovered in 2024 as a somber monument to the young men who fought in wooden boats against steel giants. Their legacy proved that courage and persistence, when integrated into a comprehensive campaign, could influence strategic outcomes even against overwhelming odds.